Continuing our coverage tonight on a controversial budget resolution in Congress and the impact it could have on health care programs like Medicaid, Medicare, and the Children's Health Insurance Program.
The budget plan calls for $880 billion in spending cuts within the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees those programs. WCT's Ariana Bertolotti taking a deeper look at the budget resolution today. Ariana, are those programs in danger?
Well, it depends on who you ask, Fran. President Trump has promised Medicaid won't be touched, and Republicans say their budget plan doesn't even mention those programs. But the committee overseeing those programs would need to trim nearly $900 billion over the next 10 years. And the reality is those programs, those health care programs, will likely face severe funding cuts. North Carolina Democrats fought for years to expand Medicaid, and the latest numbers from October show nearly 3 million people are now covered by Medicaid and CHIP. That's why advocacy groups are questioning why the poorest among us should bear the brunt of sweeping spending cuts.
People every single day who we talk to are just trying to make ends meet and work hard and play by the rules and want to make sure that they have access to the coverage that they need to survive.
However, Congressman David Rouser says while Medicaid isn't on the chopping block, government spending needs to be reined in. He says, quote, "The passage of the House budget resolution does not make any cuts to our nation's entitlement programs. This vote is the first step to eliminate wasteful and fraudulent spending, become energy dominant again, and make key permanent tax cut provisions critical to economic growth," end quote. To be sure, the budget plan also calls for trillions of dollars in cuts across nearly every government agency.
Ariana, this was just the first step in the budget process, right?
Right, Fran. And even this plan doesn't have full Republican support, meaning it could face an uphill battle in the Senate and many more changes down the road.
All right, Ariana, thanks so much.